Today, our paradigms have come full circle. Colonial powers that have sent missionaries out into the world under our last couple of paradigms are now receiving immigrants, including missionaries, back from the countries that they sent their missionaries to. And so we want to talk about two very important paradigms today. One is the global theology paradigm, and the other is the diaspora paradigm. And so I'm asking the question, what in the world is God doing? I just want to talk about the global flow of migration and whatnot. I love maps. I always have, probably always will. Maps don't tell us, only where things are. They actually conceptualize information. So look at this map right here. Here's a conceptualization of the world. Obviously not drawn to scale. And in the middle, think about for a moment, what does this map say? Maybe just pause the video for a second and write down, what do you think this map is about? I think you'll probably recognize relatively quickly this map is about showing that Jerusalem is the center of the world. It also has this very Trinitarian symbol going on. And so the world is in three major parts, and they're reflecting, this is a very theological map of the world. I said earlier this semester that Christianity started in the Middle East as a religion, as a relationship. It went to Greece, where it became a philosophy. It went to Rome, where it became a system. It went to Europe, where it became an art, and then went to the United States, where it became a business. And so it makes you think about, the shifting, how when the main voices and writers and thinkers for a particular era shift from one country to another, how their own unique context influences Christianity. And so I want you to think for a moment, where is the center of Christianity? I would say for the last several hundred years, the center has been in the West, and in particularly America. We send the most missionaries out of anybody. And so it's easy to just think, well, the books that I read are written by Americans. Well, it's probably because I don't read Mandarin and can't read the Chinese theologians. And so there's reasons for that, but the center has shifted for a while. There are two trends that have led to the shifting center of Christianity. The first of these is a de-Christianization of the Western world. So Western people tend to be much less Christian. Even if they're still religious, they're not Christian. And then the other side of this is there's the Christianization of the rest of the world. We're going to get into some specifics in a moment, but here's a map that many people are using to describe, and you can see where everything starts right there in Jerusalem, and then it shifts up into Turkey, Greece, Europe, and so this is the population center. So the population center doesn't get further than Morocco. That doesn't mean Morocco itself is the center, but it shifts that far west because of the United States. But then look at the trend. So it's hitting Morocco there on the northwest coast of Africa, and then it's as that line goes down, that's in 1970, basically till today. It's moving to the south and back to the east. So in the year 1900, 83% of Christians lived in North America and in Europe. Today, 60% of Christians, all Christians, live in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So there's been this massive transference of population center from the West, where 83% of Christians were Euro-Americans, where now 60% of them are from the other three major continents. Here's a look at the global Christian population. Christianity is the religion of over 2,000 different language groups in the world. More people pray and worship in more languages in Christianity than in any other religion in the world. And I want to give you just a little bit more granular detail. In China, there are 5 networks of underground churches in China. Each of these is larger than the largest denomination in the United States. There's 1,500 years of history that took place in Asia before Western missionaries arrived. 1,500 years before Westerners ever got there. In Africa, it has nearly 2,000 years of continuous Christian history. In 1900, under colonialism, there were 8.7 million Christians. That's not many for a continent of that size. In 1962, freed of colonialism, there were 60 million Christians. In the year 2000, there's 200 million Christians. The majority of growth of the church in Africa has been under local control, not under Western control. Very soon, 40% of all churches will be in Africa. The principle of early Christian interaction, with Latin language and culture took place in Roman Africa. Western theology is an African artifact. So many of the early church leaders, they were from Africa, including people like Athanasius. Athanasius was the first one to recognize the 66 books of the Bible that we have today. There are many other church fathers that are coming from North Africa as well. Look at colonialism for a minute. This is the extent. The British Empire was never any one moment this size. This is every country it's ever colonized. Their reach was incredible. So was their attitude. Here is a picture of one of their explorers with his foot on North Africa to South Africa. And you can see here, this is what the continent of Africa looked like. This was the height of colonialism, 1914. And so I'll, in case you can't read that on the screen, I'll read it. It says Belgium, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and then independent. So there was one country in Africa that was never colonized, and that was Ethiopia. The rest of these countries, all of those red countries, that's Great Britain. So they had Egypt, and then just this swath of countries that headed south. So each of these colonizing powers had their own interest. Even in the United States, it's easy for us to forget that we were once a colony as well. There's British colonies, French colonies, Spanish colonies here in the United States. Colonial forces opened up new mission fields. This is some of the good things. They obeyed God. They returned the Western Church to a sense of mission, which had been lacking for a long time. They were willing to go to the hard places and in hard times. The bad side was cultural imperialism. So American missionaries were purveyors of American culture and their Christianity, whether they realized it or not. It doesn't matter. But this was just part of it. It was infused with American customs, attitudes, everything. Among these was arguably an American-style privileging of individuals and families and communities, and individual religious faith and conviction over collective traditional practice. And so this is how one person who sees Christian missionaries as they came into the Muslim world in Turkey and in North Africa, how they prioritized Americanness, sometimes, at least socially, over the gospel. As I said before, one of the unintended consequences was the revival movements of Islam and Hinduism that colonial powers started. This sparked into a post-colonial movement. We closed our session last week with talking about how in the colonial era, colonial powers had the power, they made the rules. In the post-colonial era, the nationals had the power, they made the rules. And my desire is to see a new brotherhood era come about. Nationalism was another thing that colonial powers did their best to try to stave off. So countries like Iraq has never been a country. It's been part of empires before, but typically people viewed themselves as peoples. And so there was no sense of trying to unite on a larger area as a governing body. Sometimes they were governed by outside people, but there was no sense of their cooperation was necessary. In fact, they were governed whether they liked it or not. So the Brits intentionally combined Sunni, Shia, and Kurds so that they could not unite up against them and throw them off, intentionally to destabilize them. They did the same thing in Israel. They did the same thing in Egypt. And so the colonial powers tried their best to hold off nationalism, but once they returned these powers to local control, nationalism was another result of that. I think it's important when we think about global theology that we get back to some of the biblical roots. First off is the idea that God is global. Think of the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12. God gave Abraham a promise to leave his people, to leave his country. He was going to be a father of nations. He was going to bless people who blessed him and curse people who cursed him. And so you could ask the question, is Yahweh a regional God? They had only been used to regional gods at this point. But even in his call of Abraham, he was calling Abraham to the nations. Abraham very much was a kind of missionary, if we can apply that term to him, a missionary type person. How did God get Abraham to be a blessing to the nations? Well, he sent him to the nations. That seems self-evident, but he sent him away to a foreign land filled with peoples, tribal gods. Here's some of the people that you can see in Genesis 15:19: Canaanites, Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. It's a whole lot of ites. In addition to these 10, there's about 30 other peoples that spread from Egypt to Chaldea, which is mentioned by name in the first 36 chapters of Genesis. So Genesis alone, in those 36 chapters, probably mentions more countries or more regions than most other places in the Bible. And so from his very first pages, God is global, and the person he calls out to begin revealing what kind of God he is, to reveal his steadfast love, to call out a people for himself, to bring about a Messiah, to answer the problem that was from the garden in Genesis 3:15. He is doing this on a global stage at the time. He's doing it quite publicly. The Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 answers this question. I keep bringing the Jerusalem Council up again and again and again because this was a missionary moment in the church where, as it was going cross-cultural, it had to decide certain things. And one of the things that it had to decide regarding theology is, do the Gentiles have to become Jewish or not? Now, it's kind of funny because the idea today is, can Jews become Christians? But the idea in the early church was, can anybody but Jews actually become Christians? And there's one group that says, yes, they absolutely have to become Jewish. They need to be circumcised. They need to take on the law. But in the Jerusalem Council, the apostles report, look, we went, we shared the gospel, the Holy Spirit fell on them. It showed the same signs among them as it showed among us. If you look at us, we weren't even able to keep the law. And so why would we put the law onto them? Something that we could not do, why would we put that on to them? And so they agreed not to put the law onto them, not to make them take the sign of circumcision. We talk a lot in seminary and theology classes about how salvation is by faith, how justification is by faith, apart from the works of the law. And we think of this in a legal sense, and I'm not saying that's wrong. I think that's appropriate. But there's a cultural sense to see this as well. The law was not just a judicial code for the Jews. It was a cultural code. It separated you. If you could not eat pork and you could not wear certain clothes and you had to dress in a particular way, these are cultural symbols that identify you quite clearly. And so the law was not only symbolic of justice and it was also symbolic of culture. So to take on Jewish law is also to take on Jewish culture. So if we are saved apart from the law, this one means we don't have to work our way to salvation. It is by justification. But this also means we don't have to become Jewish. And if you're not Jewish and you're watching this, this is good news for us. This is truly good news. Finally, Revelation 5:9, you can see that from the beginning of the picture, from Genesis all the way to Revelation, that God has had the world on his mind. It says, "Worthy are you to take the scroll and open its seals, for you were slain, and by your blood you ransom people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation." And so we see that God is a global God. We could ask the question, isn't theology universal? I mean, doesn't everybody just see the Bible the same way? And the reality is no. When you talk about your theology in Latin America, this is one quote from a pastor. He says, when you talk about our theology, you say Latin American theology. When you talk about your theology, you just say theology. And I think this is so true. It's hard for me to recognize on the go that people see things differently. It's easy to talk about Latin American theology, Asian theology, African theology, instead of just talking about theology or theologies. When we teach theology, we often simply teach Western theology. You have to take a global theology proper class in order to learn about global theology. Here's another quote. This is Samuel Escobar. He says, what has typically been regarded as theology from the whole global church actually has been in many respects Western theology, which has been assumed to be universal theology. Many authors question the premise that theological heritage that they must receive from the West is somehow neutral and universal. They recognize that Western theology has a Western accent, and despite its claims to the contrary, as Samuel Escobar remarked, all theology is contextual. All theology has a cultural wrapping in it. Mine, yours, Latin American theology, African theology, Asian theology, it all does. That was Gene Green in Global Theology and Evangelical Perspective, which if you're looking for a good book on global theology, I would highly recommend that book. Western theology is often done in response to Catholicism. And certainly, if we look at it chronologically, this was a necessary element. If we look at our country 100 years ago, the main question was, on Sunday, what kind of church are you going to go to? What denomination church are you going to go to? Western theology has also been, I think this is important for its time, but that's not the world in which we live. Our world is filled with people from other religions. And in our city, in Houston, we have every single major religious group represented in Houston and many subgroups. We have Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, Zoroastrians, Sikhs. We have Muslims from multiple sects, Hindus from multiple sects. And so this presumption that we just need to answer Catholicism is nonsense. We need theology that speaks to our doctrine of God. How is it different from every other religion doctrine of God? Our doctrine of revelation, how do we get their scriptures? How do we understand the role of the scriptures in our life? It needs to be different from not needs to be different, but how do we understand it according to or in contrast to every other thing? Western theology is largely shaped by Enlightenment thinking in that it has secular categories. We don't see many theologians interacting with science and vice versa. It tends to accept the sort of the categorical thinking that secularism has imposed on it. It's rationalistic. It's largely focused on reason argumentation. It's somewhat scientific. It's linear. It focuses on A plus B equals C, which again, this is exactly how I'm wired. I'm wired linearly. But other cultures, they think circularly. Western theology is very abstract and it is philosophical. Finally, we see the global gospel. The sermons in Acts reflect very unique contexts. From Acts 2, at Pentecost, they start with our father Abraham, and they go and they tell the history of the Jewish people. Paul in Acts 14, when he's in Lystra, his gospel there is much more an appeal to general revelation, as it is in Acts 17. And so we see them tailor the gospel and to other contexts. The Gospels, the four Gospels, also reflect unique contexts. Each of the Gospels has an intended audience and a different purpose. If you read Mark, he's very short and succinct. You read John, he's much more polemical. If you read Matthew, he's very, very focused on Old Testament references. Luke is very focused on details. This is because they have different contexts. So they're able to tell the one story, but based on social and cultural factors, there is leniency to cast the narrative in a particular way, in a particular light. Some try to be very chronological, something like John. John kind of throws chronology out the window and focuses on other things. And so we see this freedom. So theology from a global perspective is like a kaleidoscope. We can borrow from other global theologians and look at this through a different lens. It's like a diamond where there are different facets. It's like a symphony where there's different sections, and there's wind instruments and wood instruments, and they all play together. And so the bassist doesn't look at some other instrument, the violins, and say, well, you're wrong. It's different, but the two can be harmonized. Now, this is not to say that all global theologies are correct in the same way that not all Western theologies are correct. But this is also focused on a global body. We often apply the metaphor of the body to the church or to individual churches, local churches, but the reality is that the global body of Christ is, in fact, global. Um, so as we start thinking about global theology, we have to think through what is the way forward. The way forward is not non-Western or anti-Western, which is where some people have gone with global theology, particularly in that post-colonial moment. It's our theology, in order for it to be ours, has to be anti-theirs. So it's not non-Western or anti-Western, it's just more than Western. I have to understand that my focus on the scientific world. When my child is sick, I don't wonder if there's some demonic activity. I tend to just take my child to the doctor and hope they get better. But that is my Western way of seeing things. If I was coming from Africa or somewhere else, I might, even if I don't personally believe it, at least be aware of many people around me are wondering, what spirit we have upset as to what is the cause of this calamity. The dialogue between times and cultures is the condition of a creative understanding, where creative doesn't mean innovative, as in we're making this up, but rather new insight. This has meaning potential that we have not fully grasped. In other words, I'm not trying to say that in understanding global theology that we should say, well, everyone has a right to just create new meaning that was never there. What I'm recognizing is that there was meaning that was there all along that, based on my cultural lenses and blind spots, I just never saw until I started talking with brothers and sisters from other places. I'll give you just one example of this. Global theology could be its own semester-long class, but one example would be where I did my doctorate. A lot of international students would go, and we would stay in this one building for these kind of non-residential commuter classes. Well, in this building, they did a retreat, like kind of a stay-in retreat, a spiritual retreat. And the director of this retreat scheduled in quiet time, devotional time. And all the students spread out throughout the various rooms of the building, and they had their quiet time. And he's walking through, and he sees the Americans, the Europeans, and they're each, sitting in their own chair in the corner by themselves, having their quiet time. Then he walks into the next room, and there was a group of Ugandans. And I don't know how widespread this is in Uganda, but at least with these Ugandans, this is how they were. And they're all grouped up together doing Bible study. And he goes over and he says, "No, hey, you can't, this isn't quiet time." And they go, "Well, in our country, yeah, this is quiet time. We do it together. Why would you do it alone?" And so my presupposition, based on my culture of individualism, is that quiet time is individual. But what if my cultural frame of reference were different? I mean, when you start looking into the New Testament, especially Paul's writings, a lot of times when he says "you," or when he's talking about subjects and objects, it's actually in plural. We translate them into singular in English typically, but a lot of times it's "you" plural, or there's this understanding that he's not talking about the individual but the body. So the whole idea is that we're not trying to create new meaning where there was no meaning. But the idea is that if I have a different framework, if I have, just in that one example regarding devotional time, if I have a collective versus individual mindset, I will read many scriptures differently. It will change the songs I sing. There's a song we sang at church. It was "Let the redeemed of the Lord say so." So the redeemed is a plural category, a group category. And then the chorus was individualistic. It said, "I have been redeemed, I have been redeemed, I have been redeemed." And as I was singing that, I thought, wow, how fast we move from corporate to individual. And probably I'm the weirdo for thinking this, but we need that corporate mindset. It should say, if we're talking about the redeemed, we have been redeemed. We have been redeemed. Oftentimes we talk about Jesus coming to save me, but the reality is that Jesus came to save the world, all of us. All theology, and this is true of both Western and global theologies, must be careful not to fall into the sin of "I am of Apollos." And so oftentimes we pick our camp, and sometimes to protect from global theology, we go, "Well, I'm of this camp." Or to prove how global we are, "Well, I'm of the Latin American camp in this particular area, liberation theology," or whatever. And we have to focus on the truth of the Scripture and on reading it together, not on trying to pick our camp. So I think when we talk about global theology, there needs to be some affirmations. And one is that all cultures and languages are fractured by the fall and are imperfect. And so my English way of understanding and translating the Bible into English at some point is going to have is going to give evidence of the fracture that's created by the fall. And so is your culture, and so is someone else's culture. However, all cultures, languages experience God's common grace as well, and so they're subject to the fall, but they're also benefit from God's grace. The Bible is read and interpreted by fallen interpreters who read it through cultural lenses. This is absolutely true. There's no way around this. You can't get around your presuppositions. It's better if you can recognize your presuppositions and can help adjust some things, but there's no way to truly just avoid presuppositions entirely. However, the Holy Spirit can direct interpretation. He is an active partner in our understanding to the Bible, and can use cultural and linguistic factors to help lead us. So we're going to turn our attention in the second half of this lecture to diaspora missiology.